On behalf of the History Department here at the University of Montana, I'd like to welcome you to the 2014 Swanberg Lecture in Military History. This is the third consecutive year that we've been able to hold this event, and I'm proud to announce tonight that we will be holding this event for the next 4 years. And we're able to do this because of the generosity of University of Montana alum Arnold Swanberg. I'd like to recognize Arnold this evening because it's ultimately his passion for history and military history in particular that has enlivened our campus and brought us all here this evening. Arnold Swanberg earned his bachelor's degree in history from UM in 1970. He did what UM history majors do. He went on to a thriving career in which he no doubt used many of the broad skills he cultivated here at UM to manage a series of successful businesses. He's something of a Renaissance man. He is a writer, a publisher, and a collector. He has authored a 60,000-word novel. He has also been the former publisher of Flightline magazine, a magazine devoted to the history of North American military aviation after World War II. Arnold Swanberg lives in Seattle. It's our honor and pleasure to have him here tonight, and I know you already clapped once, but I was going to ask you to clap again, so please recognize Arnold Swanberg. It's also my honor tonight to introduce our speaker, historian and writer James T. Sparrow. Jim Sparrow is currently Associate Professor of History at the University of Chicago. He earned his bachelor's degree in American History and Urban Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and he earned his PhD in Modern U.S. History from Brown University. He is the author of Warfare State, World War II Americans and the Age of Big Government, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2011. Professor Sparrow will be speaking tonight about some of the central themes of that book, and he'll be available after the lecture tonight in the lobby to sign copies of his book should you decide to take a copy home with you. They will be for sale. Buy two. In addition to his book, Professor Sparrow has published essays that have appeared in such publications as Tocqueville Review, the Journal of Policy History, and Fog of War, the Second World War and the Civil Rights Movement. He has 2 new books in the works. The first is called Atomic Liberty, Rethinking the Democratic Leviathan for the American Century. And this project explores how leading American political thinkers rethought the democratic state to accommodate the global expansion of American power after World War II. And his second project is actually a sequel to Warfare State, and it is called New Leviathan, the Foundations of American Rule in the Atomic Age, and that explores the mass politics of American military expansion in the mid-20th century. I'd also like to mention that Professor Sparrow is an extremely dedicated teacher, mentor, and what we might think of as an academic community builder. All of these things are very important to me. At the University of Chicago, he teaches a range of popular courses, including the state in U.S. history, U.S. politics and social movements in the 20th century, human rights, war in American society, and thinking total war. In his time at Chicago, he has also worked with more than 25 graduate students who have gone on to earn their doctorates in American political, military, and cultural history. And many of his students are teaching at colleges and universities across the country. In collaboration with other scholars, Professor Sparrow has also written and secured a series of academic grants to support investigation of the history of American government. He has organized workshops and symposia on American political and military history. He has led seminars for high school teachers on World War II and American history more broadly. The list truly goes on. But in so many ways, Professor Sparrow is an exemplary scholar and also a model academic citizen, and it comes as no surprise that as of January 1st, he will hold the position as Master of the Collegiate Social Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. We are very lucky to have him here with us tonight. please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Sparrow.
Thank you, Kyle, for that overly generous introduction, and for being a lively host. Thank you, Arnold Swanberg, for creating the occasion for this talk and the larger series of lectures that it's a part of. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. We already started over lunch, a lively discussion that will continue afterwards into the workshop tomorrow. And it's wonderful to come out here to Montana and witness the vitality that's really taking off here in the history department, which I'd also like to thank for the invitation. Well, although my talk today is about World War II, America, I want to begin with a story that Democratic Senator Fritz Hollings of South Carolina famously liked to tell back in the Reagan 80s. It goes something like this. Some of you may have heard this story. A veteran went to college on the GI Bill, bought his house with an FHA loan, saw his kids born in a VA hospital, started a business with an SBA loan, got electricity from the TVA and later water from an EPA project. His parents on Social Security retired to a farm, got electricity from the REA, and had their soil tested by the USDA. When his father became ill, the family was saved from financial ruin by Medicare, and a life was saved with a drug developed by the NIH. His kids participated in the school lunch program, learned physics from teachers trained in an NSF program, and went to college with guaranteed student loans. He drove to work on the interstate and moored his boat in a channel dredged by Army engineers. When floods hit, he took Amtrak to Washington to apply for disaster relief and spent some time in the Smithsonian museums. Then, one day, he got mad. He wrote his congressman an angry letter. "Get the government off my back," he said. "I'm tired of paying for all those programs created for ungrateful people." Well, this kind of thinking has become a prominent, perhaps even a defining, aspect of politics today. The laundry list of programs in Hollings' compressed allegory is really a list of collective obligations. In other countries, they would be understood as obligations owed to the nation. But in the United States, we see only entitlements, which become a kind of personal property claimed through the language of rights. Commentators like to trace this confusion to recent developments in national politics, but Hollings was telling his story back in the 1980s, and even then, it was kind of familiar. I would like to argue in this talk that the origins of this confusion go much farther back, in a paradox planted decades ago at the center of the social contract that legitimized the most centralized and powerful government the United States had ever seen to that point during World War II. The Americans who lived through the Second World War partook of a sweeping transformation in the foundations of national government. Internationally, American power leapt far beyond territorial bounds, inaugurating an era of globalization, or globalism, I should say, of American power. Domestically, warfare replaced welfare as the central purpose of the national state. More than in any period since the Civil War, changes in government politicized everyday life, touching nearly every American. For soldiers and civilians alike, the war instilled a sense of entitlement to full citizenship. And that sense of entitlement, the federal government would increasingly have to placate, even if not always fulfill, in subsequent years. At the same time, and for related reasons, the integrity of the state and the loyalty of its employees and citizens became paramount concerns defining national political life. So total war changed the stakes of national government, even in the United States, where it brought full employment and economic mobilization rather than shelled out cities and masses of refugees. Within the span of half a decade, the United States departed from some of its longest and most dearly held traditions. It inaugurated the first peacetime draft, and deployed a large and permanent standing army stationed worldwide. It became entangled in precisely the kinds of alliances that Washington had warned against in the early years of the Republic. And it even launched the mass income tax and became reliant on structural deficits, despite the aversion to taxing and spending that also goes back to the founding. The departure from precedent was striking even when set against the recent expansion of the welfare state under the New Deal in the 1930s, just a few years before. The agencies that conducted the mobilization for the Second World War quickly dwarfed those programs that had seemed gargantuan only a few years earlier. To give you a sense of the scope of that state expansion, here's one measure, just the proportion of the population in military service. And you can see how dramatically it increases during the war, but then after the war, it never goes down to the levels even remotely close to the pre-war period. So this is one index of militarization and government presence. Another index would be federal employment as a proportion of the labor force and the population. And so the top line is a proportion of the labor force, and the bottom line is the population. And here you see the same pattern of an extraordinary increase in federal employment as a presence within American society. Not only did the government expand in sheer size, just as importantly, it dramatically extended the scope and the nature of its authority. So it's a qualitative shift that was equally important. The state of emergency, for example, declared by the Second War Powers Act of 1942, did not officially end until 1952, by which time another war had continued the state of emergency. Given the traditions of individualism and decentralized governance that had long conspired to thwart a centralized national state in the U.S., the triumphal and the unimpeded ascent of big government in the 1940s requires an explanation. How was it that this massive new warfare state, with its global mission, attracted so little of the dissent and opposition that had marked other conflicts, from the Civil War to the First World War, and once again in the Vietnam War? In the 1940s, there were no tax revolts, there were no draft riots, there was no post-war isolationism, at least as an overt stance. The compliance, even the quiescence that attended the dramatic policy departures of these years requires explanation. The answers that millions of Americans gave to the question of why we fight that help answer this question mattered deeply and were consequential. They mattered for the patriotism and for the national citizenship that the war effort cultivated in those citizens. And just as importantly, those reasons mattered for the emerging structures of a national state that could not win the war without their compliance. The activist state changed profoundly when its goals and modes of political mobilization shifted from welfare to warfare. It took the Roosevelt administration some time to realize this. Much as one might retrofit an automobile factory to produce bombers, Roosevelt and his speechwriters retooled their ideological framework in the late 1930s and early 1940s, portraying the coming confrontation with fascism as if it were an international extension of reform principles, what Liz Borgwart has called a New Deal for the world. The Atlantic Charter and the other visionary statements of New Deal internationalism reflected this sensibility. But the foundations for the government's legitimacy shifted as well, not just the ideological framing. As New Dealers adapted the imagery and the meanings of activist government to suit the requirements of a national interest that was now defined by military security rather than by economic security, economic stability, and social justice. So there's a transposition here that subtly transformed New Deal state building. To promote national unity and full mobilization, government propagandists placed an emphasis on personal sacrifice, a strategy that emerged from early insight into the psychology of civilian morale. It's an extensive research apparatus that measured this morale, and the size of that apparatus actually indicates how important morale was. Government propagandists learned from confidential survey research that simply imploring civilians to do their part and to sacrifice was not sufficient to motivate them to comply with the many requirements of the war mobilization. The most effective appeals were those that transformed personalized government messages while downplaying overt ideological statements. Taken together with what the messages amounted to overall as a sort of rhetorical strategy is what George Roeder, the art historian, has termed the home front analogy. You can see this as a strategy of persuasion in this poster, which equated the conservation of the runoff from one's nightly cooking with the salvage of nitrates to help produce explosive material for World War II weaponry. But it was used in almost every poster and almost every message, equating home front actions with fighting on the battlefront. What this produced was a pointed evaluation, a pointed critique or scrutiny of every conceivable aspect of civilian life according to its contribution to the war effort, most often by tracing the battlefront consequences of ordinary decisions at home with an appeal to the folk wisdom in the maxim, for the want of a nail, the horse was lost. For the want of a horse, the war was lost. In this rhetorical universe, defense workers were promoted to soldiers of production. Home gardens became victory gardens, and young women willing to socialize with soldiers were called, euphemistically, victory girls. But the analogy applied in many different contexts and proved to be very effective in a quite pragmatic sense. Here you have the equation of war bond stamps with a machine gun magazine. Stamps were very popular among children. They would buy them in small increments and then put them into a stamp book and buy a war bond, usually doing this through school. And it helped to mold young minds and orient their economic learning around this larger war purpose. Even the most private or mundane aspects of life were made relevant to the war effort, usually by contrasting in a negative way civilian concerns about inflation, prices, rationing, you name it, with the drastic sacrifices of idealized combat soldiers. You can imagine coming home from a factory at the end of a long day and seeing this. What did you do today for freedom? These messages hit home, but not always in the way that the government intended them to. Different parts of the population responded in different ways. Another example of this strategy of persuasion centered around the Sullivan brothers. Some of you may have seen Saving Private Ryan. That's a fictionalized version of the 5 Sullivan brothers who were all lost in the Battle of the Solomons at the same time. And they became real-life personal embodiments of this abstract combat soldier. Well, it was this idealized symbol of nationalistic self-sacrifice, the combat soldier, that provided the master key to wartime political culture. The GI was a culture hero whose name stood for, ironically, government issue. It was a joking reference to the standardized nature of the military in which he served. He personified the new ideals of a changing social order. His ordinariness and his common touch conveyed the democratic and the humane nature of the American war effort, in sharp contrast to the regimentation and the hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, or the fanaticism of Japanese dive bombers. At the same time, he represented martial virtues that supplanted the more social democratic conception of the Depression-era man on the street. The GI's appeal was also personal. He provided individuals with a model onto whom they could project an intimate identification, as if he were a brother, a father, a son, or a husband, which was often the case. There are a few people who didn't have someone close to them who was in service. The GI was a rugged individual. He did his part, but he didn't get too sentimental about it. He was an ordinary Joe, but most of all, the GI was a hero who dominated the society and the culture of the American home front. And he was vested with a moral authority that did not fade away after the war ended. In fact, much of the post-war period saw the impress of this ideal. So the government subtly and quite unintentionally politicized everyday life by drawing these connections between the battlefront and the home front so insistently. It sought to inculcate sacrifice, but what it did instead was attached actions called sacrifice to visions of fighting this war. Propaganda of this sort encouraged citizens to think expansively about the moral significance of their own part in the war, no matter how small. As the war propelled millions of migrants and GIs beyond the confines of their local circumstances, their hometowns, to pursue broader horizons, it placed them in new contact with the federal government, which up to that point had been fairly distant from ordinary citizens. And the ideological guarantees featured in the government's propaganda suddenly had concrete ramifications in their everyday life. My book looks at three realms in which this mass mobilization for total war politicized everyday life: fiscal citizenship, mass income tax paying and war bond holding, industrial war work, and military service. And these were the three real foundations on which the ability of the U.S. government to wage a global war in two theaters was founded. Without those mass foundations, it would have been impossible for the United States to participate in one theater, much less two. Well, fiscal citizenship was absolutely central to the American war mobilization, which relied on an overwhelming superiority of industrial production. The United States produced over 5 times what the Japanese produced and over twice what the Germans produced by 1943. So this was the vital contribution that Americans made, financed, of course, by taxes and by debt. The Second World War was 10 times more expensive than its predecessor, which had been quite expensive too. And you can see here the sudden onset of fiscal citizenship among ordinary citizens. Before the war, only the wealthy had paid income taxes. Suddenly, between 1941 and 1943, over 60% of the labor force was paying income taxes. The poor, the working poor, were paying income taxes. So you have just a sudden onset of fiscal citizenship, and that went along with an even larger proportion of the population that was buying war bonds, so owning a piece of the federal debt. Without these tax payments and bond purchases and the subsequent votes of those taxpayers and bondholders to elect Congresses that would sustain the new fiscal system rather than dismantle or undermine it, as had happened after World War I, the post-war state would have stood on feet of clay, ready to crumble at the slightest challenge. Growth politics, on which post-war American affluence was built, and the global ambitions that growth politics bankrolled, both of these depended on the economic and the political compliances of ordinary Americans. And we see today, as support for taxation goes down, so too do you see the foundations of American global power shaking. Contrary to common wisdom, mass participation in the new fiscal regime was, in fact, far from automatic, even if income tax withholding was automatic for industrial employees. And by automatic, I mean mechanical, but they still had to all file tax forms by the end of the fiscal year. Enforcement and patriotic peer pressure, although necessary, were not sufficient to get the entire populace to learn how to participate in the instruments of public finance. The American people needed to be habituated to paying their taxes, and this is when it happened in the midst of World War II. And you see, again, the same pattern, but here for taxpayers as a proportion of the labor force and the population, spiking and then staying at this very high level. So this pattern locks in World War II. There's a period right after when it dips a little bit, but not much, and it doesn't go anywhere near the levels that in the 30s seemed high but now look minuscule. So this is when big government and the fiscal foundations of big government start, in World War II, not in the 1930s. To accomplish mass participation in war finance, the Treasury had to overcome a formidable cultural challenge, And I'm sure you're all thinking, yeah, nobody wants to have to pay taxes, and certainly not when Roosevelt had just been spending the better part of a decade arguing that the rich should be soaked for taxes because they had the means to pay. But in fact, the challenge was less dramatic and yet maybe more significant than that. Taxpayers and bondholders had to be taught how to perform their duties, which most of them were, in fact, quite happy to perform in the context of a national emergency. So how do they do this? To get a sense of how the Treasury accomplished this formidable task of educating 60% of the labor force in how to become taxpayers and bondholders, consider the pitch-perfect approach of the radio star and maternal patriotic icon, Kate Smith, pictured here. And she artfully combined all the techniques that invoked personal obligation to the soldier when she conducted a radio marathon in September of 1943 that raised a record-breaking $39 million in war bond pledges over the course of 18 hours. Smith wasted no time in turning immediately to a gripping tale of devotion to the combat soldier. Not 10 minutes into her broadcast, she recounted the words of a man whose speech at a recent bond rally had cast the home front analogy in a bitter light that didn't resemble exactly what the government was putting out as official propaganda, but in some ways reinforced it far more powerfully because of its emotional punch. This was what he said at that rally. "You know, friends, when we buy war bonds, we're not buying tanks and guns and shells and planes. What we're really doing is buying our boys back. We're bringing them home to us, safe and sound once again. Now, I know there isn't a person listening to me who wouldn't give everything he has to buy his boy back. I'd give anything, all my money or my health or my own life, to buy my boy back from the war, but I'm afraid I can't do that now. You see, I got a telegram from Washington this morning. My boy isn't coming back." You can imagine the impact of these kinds of messages, personal, authentic, immediate, on the audience listening. Smith concluded the segment by asking her audience, "When you think of these wounded and suffering boys who are paying so great a price, can you honestly think that any sacrifice you have made is enough?" And immediately after she said that, the social scientists studying this bond rally saw an immediate spike in contributions. This approach worked. A large body of Treasury-funded research amply demonstrated that fact. Weighing their own sacrifices against those of the idealized combat soldier, Americans would consent to buy their boys back in record numbers in World War II. And these were the kinds of terms in which people thought of making that commitment or that relationship to the soldiers. Messages aimed at children were especially effective in habituating Americans to fiscal citizenship, while working liberal ideology into the curriculum at the same time. War bond savings clubs taught math skills and civics lessons, while also allowing students to provision G.I. Joe one stamp at a time, paying for maybe his trench tools or his rifle or a grenade. On the scale of an entire school, a big urban school, it was possible to buy jeeps and even aircraft that were emblazoned with plaques that identified the school and the town's bond with the combat soldier. So here are some examples of how that worked. You see here, the suggestion is really that buying a war bond is really more of a consumer activity, like buying a toy Jeep for children, rather than being an investment, which is how the Treasury originally wanted to cast it. Another example of how bond purchasers and war workers could identify with their work were the dramatic launches of great battleships in the ports of the wartime nation. These were especially gripping and significant and motivating for war workers whose bond rallies were held right alongside the war equipment that they were producing for the conflict. And the most effective promotion of all during the war was this "Here is Your Infantry" show, in which actual soldiers, combat veterans, came back from the front and reenacted battle scenes with authentic equipment and live action, if not live ammunition, on the town green in hometowns around America. This was the kind of thing that got Americans not just to buy war bonds, but to keep on buying an extra war bond after they had already met their 10% obligation. On the whole, the Treasury succeeded in educating American consumers to their obligations as fiscal citizens, perhaps suggesting why there was no tax revolt for a long time thereafter. To a surprising degree, Americans accepted their new taxes as legitimate, if unpleasant. An astonishing 85 to 90% of respondents consistently indicated that they felt their taxes were fair in the last years of the war, even then when patience for exhortations to sacrifice grew thin. These polls keep going through the post-war period, and Americans say they think their federal income taxes are the fairest taxes they pay up until about 1974. So that's a whole generation of people who, as a larger population, do not begin to systematically criticize or challenge their obligation to pay the income tax. But then suddenly, and quite dramatically in the 70s and especially the 80s, that changes when the wartime social contract starts to give way and the Vietnam era kicks in. Most importantly, the resulting sensibility from this fiscal social contract, which is articulated in the phrase, "that's my tax dollar." In other words, I have a claim, I have a stake, I can say something because I'm paying these taxes. That sensibility has resonated throughout the national political culture ever since. And the sense of entitlement captured by that phrase began to reveal itself even during the war, when the sacrifice, so-called, of tax-paying and bondholding were portrayed as down payments on a higher standard of living in the post-war period. In other words, Americans began to feel like they had earned a higher standard of living by paying taxes and war bonds. This would wreak havoc with the anti-inflation program that was so necessary to the war effort. Well, a similar, if more contentious, dynamic of obligation and entitlement took place among industrial workers in the war factories that produced America's overwhelming material superiority in the global conflict. And I've already suggested this is absolutely vital. Production is the key to the American contribution to victory over fascism. War workers took very seriously their image as so-called soldiers of production in what was then referred to as the arsenal of democracy. Like taxpayers and bondholders, they thought of their moral link to the fighting front by objectifying it in the war material that they sent to the GIs from the shop floor. So I've already mentioned that ship that was depicted, but much of the propaganda that was posted in the workplace that workers would see when they looked up from their lathes looked something like this. And here you can see the visual representation is intended to underscore the link, that just as the worker's downward motion of his arm echoes the downward flight of the enemy aircraft. A more complicated image that captures this in almost a diorama-like fashion has the worker on the shop floor handing a shell to naval seamen on a ship at battle as if there's no distance between them, while Uncle Sam looks on in approval. There's a large body of research that I'm compressing here that suggests that it's precisely this kind of equation that most motivated workers and cause them to identify with the war effort, but also to then begin to think of themselves as having entitlements to national citizenship. Previous scholars have emphasized other factors like labor militancy, and I'm suggesting patriotism is an incredibly powerful contributor to this. Well, this powerful sense that workers had that they were fighting alongside the combat soldier not only linked the home front to the battlefront, but it fostered this rising sense of entitlement to national citizenship. For women and black workers, this revealed itself in a rising determination to press the government to honor its promise of fair employment, which was made to help convince both groups to expand the labor force because 12 million men were serving at the time and had therefore left the labor force. Although neither women nor African Americans realized these goals during the war, both groups were permanently politicized by the experience, thereby launching a generation of civil rights, unionism, and labor feminism, which subsequent scholarship has suggested was very important to both movements in the long run. White ethnic workers enjoyed more immediate gains during the war, as labor boards recognized union leaders as junior partners in the councils of war. The institutionalization of labor arbitration specifically, which happened during the war and not during the 30s, when much of the labor history focuses its attention on the government's role. Arbitration made union rights of membership, seniority, hiring, firing, and work conditions something that the federal government now had to manage on a daily basis in a sort of microeconomic fashion, as opposed to as an umpire through NLRB elections, which is much less intrusive. The ability of working-class Americans to join the affluent society in the 1940s and to rise within it for the next 2 decades was a product of this labor-right social contract that was produced by war mobilization and patriotic identification. Yet the claims to fuller social citizenship came at a great cost. Both arbitration and nationalism undercut union militancy. The strike wave of 1945 to 1946, immediately after the conclusion of the war, turned out to be labor's last hurrah rather than the social democratic revolution that figures like Walter Reuther had hoped it might be. Some of this was due to the internal dynamics of the labor movement as it devolved into bread-and-butter unionism over time, but of equal importance to that was the role that Americanism and patriotism played in curbing and policing and limiting and circumscribing what kinds of claims workers could make on their employers. This was the double-edged nature of the bargain with the warfare state. Mounting demands that the soldiers of production be forced to work or fight, as the slogan had it, crested right alongside the increasing wildcat strikes, unauthorized strikes, that many workers indulged as a symbolic protest of wage caps and managerial control that the war agencies had imposed. As the wildcats continued, even Roosevelt became convinced that a national service law was necessary. Indeed, he introduced a full-blown proposal for national service as the price that Americans should pay for his widely publicized economic Bill of Rights. By the time of his last fireside chat in January of 1945, Roosevelt had shifted from his Depression-era emphasis on the derelictions of the wealthy to excoriate workers who, quote, lay down on their essential jobs, exacting a price whose payment would have to be made in, quote, the life's blood of our own sons. So a very big shift in Roosevelt's language and imagery. Once again, he urged the Congress to adopt national service legislation to provide our fighting men with, quote, supreme proof that civilians were giving them what they are entitled to, the soldiers, that is, which is nothing less than our total effort back home. Almost as an afterthought, he reiterated his earlier commitment to an economic Bill of Rights. Well, this was Roosevelt at his crankiest. He was dying slowly and would die in a matter of months, and he had grown impatient even with the stalwarts among his own electoral base in the Democratic Party. But it revealed also how the nationalistic logic of Americanism and entitlement could serve either master, Americanism or entitlement, depending on who held the reins of national politics and what needs the managers of the warfare state deemed most urgent. Labor scarcity, stability, depended on the contexts. But this new way of making claims was now maturing. In the immediate post-war years, Soviet ambitions in Eastern Europe and elsewhere altered understandings of what the national interest was, while the labor scarcity of the Second World War evaporated with the return of 9 million soldiers within a year of VJ Day. In this context, the enemies of labor would take its demonization to extremes, the sort of worker-fight politics, portraying the social democratic energies that had been unleashed and in some ways celebrated by the war, and the assertiveness they inspired in industrial workers, as instead an un-American subversion mounted by communists and fellow travelers. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which mirrored or systematized a number of wartime measures that emerged from this labor politics and the reaction to it, that Taft-Hartley Act would ultimately institutionalize these restraints on social democracy. But Taft-Hartley also, and crucially, institutionalized arbitration, this practice that made labor rights permanent, if not transformative. And this And one reason this was so consequential was that high and uninterrupted levels of industrial production remained essential throughout the semi-war mobilization of the Cold War. So warfare continued to feed this particular kind of labor-right politics while undercutting the radical claims that were survivals of the 1930s. The most dramatic illustration of the tensions and trade-offs that attended the wartime fusion of Americanism and entitlement is provided appropriately by the citizen soldiers who did the fighting. GIs were walking, talking proof that the last thing you want to be in a time of war is a living symbol of national sacrifice. In the end, it was their sacrifice that determined the legitimacy of this new war government, and it did so in fateful ways. The mass experience of military service during World War II fostered two irreconcilable conflicts among the GIs. On the one hand, near universal military service inculcated a deep sense of national commitment that remains a defining aspect of the war generation's outlook to the extent that they're still walking among us, although the numbers are diminishing. Although no more than 1 out of every 10 would see a shot fired in anger, all 16 million who served over the course of the war placed their lives at the disposal of their country, and each was held to this standard of the idealized combat soldier, which was also a masculinized standard, so reinforcing gendered expectations of citizenship. Despite the fact that the GIs carried the heaviest burden of the war squarely on their weary shoulders, most sustained powerful attachments to the country that they served, particularly that part of it that they called home. As one former factory worker, Edmund Borsowitz, wrote back to his buddies at the National Brooch Shop in Detroit in December of 1945, "It's good to know that the plant that I worked for once is turning out equipment of the best quality, so fellows overseas will have the best to carry on with." So you see that he's carrying this laborite worker identification with soldier of production imagery. But now he's on the other side. He's serving. And Borsowitz and others cherished the mail that they received from home, from the factories. The National Brooch factory preserved the correspondence between workers who remained in the factory and those who went to serve in the war. So that's how we know Borsowitz's story. But as you can see from this photograph here of soldiers getting their mail in the Pacific, this was a vital lifeline. So the analogy worked in reverse. There was also an intensely personal, vicarious connection that the soldiers had with the home front. And it really informed what they were fighting for, as Samuel Stelfer's research has suggested. On the other hand, however, the GIs also felt resentment at civilians' relative freedom, because after all, they really weren't sacrificing all that much compared to the soldiers on the battlefront, but also compared to other civilian populations in France and England and other places. Much like taxpayers, bondholders, and industrial workers, servicemen selectively appropriated some central themes of wartime political culture to make sense of their experiences. So the lesson that's coming out here of this research is just because you have one message going out doesn't mean that everyone is being brainwashed. And in fact, this selective appropriation is quite striking in the soldiers. As with their civilian counterparts, the soldiers made these appropriations and took actions that reflected this appropriation of the combat hero in a way that suggested how Americanism and entitlement were mutually defined, mutually constituted, and really shaped the kinds of citizenship claims that could be made in the post-war period. Since we all know a great deal about the heroism of the GIs from the many books and films that have celebrated the Allied triumph over fascism during World War II, I'm going to focus here on exploring the less familiar and less celebrated but still very important truths that revealed themselves when morale broke down and servicemen marked out what they considered to be the outer boundaries of their sacrifice. Heroic victories are not so revealing of what the limits of the social contract are, but the breakdown of morale is a far more useful window or place in which to study how far soldiers would go before they would refuse to sacrifice or make a clear statement about what they thought the sacrifice should be. This is a photograph from the Zoot Suit riots in June of 1943, and you can see in the faces of these sailors who flooded out onto the streets in that week a determination and a sense of righteousness that reflected the sense of purpose with which they hunted down Zoot Suiters, Mexican-American youths known as Pachucos, who wore flamboyant, highly tailored and personalized suits. And despite the many divisions among the soldiers according to rank, race, branch, or even theater of service, American servicemen shared a set of experiential coordinates that oriented them toward each other, toward the military, and toward the nation. Almost to a man, they resented what they called the rear echelon of other soldiers and civilians who were more removed from the fighting than they were. And it, understandably so. Some of you, if you've read Catch-22, will be familiar with this kind of sensibility, as exaggerated and made very humorous by Joseph Heller. This resentment was true at the same time that servicemen nonetheless clung to memories of home and relished any contact with family and friends while on leave or through the mail. The ambivalent mixture of, on the one hand, longing and affection for their lost civilian identity, and, on the other hand, resentment of bearing most of the burden of wartime sacrifice, had powerful effects, lifelong effects, on servicemen's identities. Consequently, they regarded their military service as a crucible of both their manhood and their national citizenship, which together defined their Americanism. What GIs could not abide was any indication that their sacrifices were being undermined, mocked, or capitalized upon by civilians or stateside soldiers. And these were sailors who were just about to head out for duty. The moral map of wartime society, implied by the notion of a rear echelon, revealed just what the hero worship of the combat soldier looked like from the inside, from the soldier's point of view. It wasn't always pretty, as this photo suggests. GIs agreed with civilians that proximity to the hell of combat deemed worthiness, but then that turned the equation or the moral valence of equating combat and sacrifice in an opposite direction under certain circumstances, such as this one. And perhaps the starkest demonstration of the GI's resentment of the rear echelon took place on the streets of Los Angeles in early June of 1943 during the Zoot Suit riots, when bands of sailors and soldiers and Marines got together in taxi cabs and in crowds and hunted down the Zoot Suiters in order to strip off their flamboyant garb. Acting on a mounting sense of outrage, spurred by previous street battles with the Pachucos, they went to set things straight. During the violent outbreak, which set off a whole summer of rioting in Detroit and elsewhere, and racial tension as well, the servicemen banded together and hunted down dwellers of what they perceived to be a criminal underworld. And so here, these are two Zoot Suiters who've been stripped of their suits. What's really striking about the Zoot Suit riots, as opposed to almost all the other racial violence of World War II, is how mostly symbolic it was. Yes, people were beaten up. One man lost an eye. But compared to Detroit, where you had scores dead, what's really striking is how much of the crowd action centered around symbolically destroying the suits, tearing them off, burning them, stomping them, celebrating the destruction of the Zoot Suit. To the rioting white servicemen, the Zooters were sinister figures who wore the emblems of their subversive intent on their backs. These flamboyant Zoot Suits flaunted an excessive use of cloth, which qualified the suits as black market items according to the War Production Board regulations. In the eyes of most soldiers and white civilians, the suits and the lifestyle that they advertised were a defiant rejection of the moral economy of the war. They inverted the soldiers' uniforms, and they mocked the soldiers' sacrifice. Here's just an example of what a sort of a full zoot suit looked like. And you get a sense of how easily criminalized zoot suiters were, even if they weren't guilty of any crime, and but how quickly it was easy to portray zoot suiters in a criminal light. And it was because of this self-indulgent, unpatriotic excess of consumerism that the soldiers were lashing out against. So through this ritualized and pointedly symbolic violence, the soldiers reasserted their moral authority, demonstrating en masse their sense of what the social contract was supposed to be and how it should be set right. However, Mexican Americans saw things very differently. They and their advocates, like Carrie McWilliams, responded. But it's revealing that they didn't respond by denouncing militarism or soldiering per se. They responded instead by embracing the ideal of the combat soldier and emphasizing their own patriotism in military service, which the rioting white servicemen threatened to undermine. One zoot suiter put it eloquently, "Pretty soon I guess I'll be in the Army and I'll be glad to go, but I want to be treated like everyone else. We're tired of being told we can't go to this show or that dance hall because we're Mexican, or that we better not be seen in the beachfront, or that we can't wear draped pants or have our hair cut the way we want to." This sense of entitlement, which became absolutely critical to the civil rights movements among Mexican Americans, African Americans who also wore zoot suits in other cities, and other groups, was being born at this moment. But the American standard of living was still in the process of becoming an entitlement to which American citizens might lay claim, and so it proved too provocative when sported by Pachucos. The military uniform had been too thoroughly glorified to brook any challenge. So who then had more authority to put the zooters in their place than the servicemen whose sacrifice was the polar star for an entire home front culture? And again, revealing in this symbolic violence is that it was mostly the soldiers who were allowed to destroy the suits. And the civilians were often an audience, and a cheering audience, egging them on. But the right to destroy the suit was reserved to the soldiers for the most part. Well, a final window onto the tension between Americanism and entitlement that shaped these GIs' emerging sense of national citizenship appeared during the so-called Army Mutiny that broke out between December of 1945 and February of 1946, so several months after the war had ended. Due to breakneck demobilization after the war and a refusal to raise draft quotas, both of which were compromises accepted by the Truman administration in response to powerful political pressure after VJ Day, the Army revealed that it would have to depart from the point system that had promised GIs an orderly way of anticipating when they would be released from their military service. The military went from 12 million in the summer of 45 down to 3 million in the summer of 46. So there needed to be a system to determine how men would be released. Gradually, it became clear, as this rapid demobilization took place, that about 1 million men, or more than 1 million men, who qualified for release under the point system would have to remain at their stations anyway until shipping conditions and military recruitment improved. This about-face proved explosive, and it was so explosive to prompt mutiny because of the nature of the point system, which really gets at this mass habituation to the moral criteria for sacrifice. Based on extensive Army research into the criteria that the GIs felt would make for the fairest demobilization policies, the point system awarded priority for release to combat, length of service, especially overseas service, and family dependence. This is what the soldiers felt gave one claim on being released from battle, which was the highest goal at that point, was to get out of war now that the war was over. So here was a precise arithmetical calculation of a man's moral worth within the wartime political culture provided by this point system. By abandoning that point system, the Army had abrogated this fictive social contract under which mass conscription had been deemed legitimate. There was almost no resistance to conscription because of this contract, and now it had been broken. In response, The soldiers turned the tables on their superiors to demonstrate their displeasure and their lack of consent, and they immediately demonstrated how critical legitimacy was to this vast state. It wasn't enough for it to be illegal to disobey your commanding officer. The response among the troops was immediate and spontaneous, although it quickly became more organized and politically potent in the weeks that followed. On Christmas Day, 1945, a rowdy group of 4,000 soldiers stationed in Manila marched on the replacement depot headquarters. They were sent back to their barracks by Colonel J.C. Campbell, who barked, "You men forget you're not working for General Motors," where the UAW had just shut down operations with a massive strike around the same time. On January 6, a mob of perhaps 20,000 soldiers, which is considerable, converged on the command headquarters in City Hall to confront the local commander, Lieutenant General William Steyer. The protests soon spread from the Pacific, spread around the world. Where they were most intense in the Pacific, they soon became important in other theaters, reaching Paris and London before long. The unrest spread even to the occupation troops, who were still in something of a state of war and should have known better, according to Time magazine. When Secretary of War Robert Patterson visited Yokohama on an inspection tour of the Pacific, he was greeted with boos. In Frankfurt, Germany, 2,000 men entered the Army headquarters and harangued their commanding officer, Lieutenant Joseph T. McNarney, goading him to come out and meet his troops. When they were informed that he was attending a meeting of the four powers in Berlin, they booed and hissed, and they mocked him. Predictably, Army officials charged treachery and subversion. Major General Clovis Byers, the Chief of Staff for the 8th Army in Japan, claimed, quote, "It appears that subversive forces are deliberately at work for obscure reasons, attempting to undermine the morale of our Army." Byers was not alone in this conviction. The newly resurrected House Committee on Un-American Activities began an investigation of communist subversion among protesting GIs and left-leaning veterans organizations. Committee counsel Ernie Adamson claimed that, quote, "communist agitators actually went into the Army for the sole purpose of causing trouble." The Catholic journal Commonweal noted that the Communist Party organs and fellow traveling sheets had provided an abundance of slogans for orientating the protest. What looked to these conservative commentators to be a conspiracy was, in fact, the spontaneous and massive response of the soldiers to a change in the terms of their sacrifice for the nation. And that's reflected in the fact that in the end, none of the mutineers were court-martialed, even as accusations of treason and sabotage were hurled at striking workers who were participating in perfectly legal strikes during the Great Strike Wave of 1945 to 46 that shut down much of American industry. So the image of the combat soldier was too sacred to warrant consistent treatment, but it did elicit consistent respect, and it was the foundation on which state power could rest. Well, there was an exquisite irony to this state of affairs. This is another photo that shows Pachucos. Sort of some of the mob looks kind of all-American, and then another part is wearing zoot suits. And for the Pachucos, this didn't seem like a contradiction, but to the soldiers it did. Well, the irony of this state of affairs has to do with the GI Bill of Rights. The soldiers in this mutiny and in Stars and Stripes, they considered themselves to be second-class citizens. They wrote into Stars and Stripes, this servicemen's newspaper, about how they felt that they had been relegated to the status of second-class citizens. And they risked being court-martialed for mutiny in order to challenge that status and return themselves to a civilian life that was devoid of what one letter writer called the aristocracy-peasantry relationship imposed by the top brass. There's extraordinary class tension in the Army. Yet the society to which they returned, in fact, guaranteed them, or the 14 million of them who would become white veterans, a first-class citizenship whose scope and comprehensiveness was unparalleled in the history of the U.S. welfare state. American veterans actually get a European-style welfare state after World War II. So there's a great irony in that sense of being deprived of citizenship precisely at the moment of its bestowal. The imagined moral bonds that connected civilians' hero worship of the combat soldier, imaginatively, figuratively, to the GI's assertion of entitlement to full citizenship due to his sacrifice for the nation, formed a perfect closed circuit by 1945. This became a foundation for national citizenship, and the GI Bill became a template for post-war expectations of full citizenship. It was this closed circuit of Americanism and entitlement that would define expansive notions of national citizenship rights throughout the post-war period, while at the same time policing and politically sustaining the ever-growing national security state over the course of the next 3 decades. And it's that paradox that I'd like to leave you with, and thank you for listening patiently to the talk. At this point, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Well, I'm surprised in this age of big government politics and debates about war and our responsibilities to the American soldiers that there are questions about the origins of some of this in World War II.
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
Yes. In a class last year, I read an article in Time magazine about how the change from a conscription army to a volunteer army changed the character of our armed forces and maybe removed images of warfare from the public view, in a sense. And I was wondering, maybe you could comment on how conscription in World War II affected the war effort as opposed to the wars we see today.
Sure. Thank you for your question. Well, a couple of things. First of all, this was the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, and conscription had been a problem for going back to the origins of American political traditions because of the nature of the British occupation of colonial North America and American opposition to standing armies and continental traditions of militarism. This had become a big part of militias and citizen soldiering, and had informed the way that American military development proceeded up until really the First World War, or the turn of the century, when the Army and the Navy began to modernize. But there had not been any peacetime conscription until this conflict. And there was a battle over it because of the politics of neutrality. But once, let's say at least once Pearl Harbor came along, there was no serious criticism of conscription, and there were few conscientious objectors. Compared to the First World War, when there was massive draft avoidance throughout the South, for example, as well as among particular communities that were opposed, it's striking how little resistance there was. And even the conscientious objectors themselves were more likely to sign on for national service, in part because the draft law had been modified in some ways to allow for that sort of national service, despite an unwillingness to fight. And this draft system, the selective service, remained in place with a period of suspension. It wasn't shut down, but new draft calls were not issued, of about 1.5 years after World War II, after 1947. And then it was reinstituted soon thereafter and continued through the Nixon administration. By the time you get to Vietnam, draft protests are, they're destabilizing American life and American politics. And President Nixon quite consciously was convinced that it was necessary to remove this source of destabilization, in part because the moral claim of military service was so powerful, and the symbolic act of burning your draft card was so upsetting. And so this political culture of the war was still alive and well. But his thought was that if you could shift to an all-volunteer force, then you could also remove the sense that families had that all of their sons were in jeopardy with every foreign policy commitment. And that those families whose sons were in jeopardy would have already signed on for that through the all-volunteer force. So it would remove the sense that every overseas intervention would produce popular evaluation. And in many ways, he was right about the effects of shifting to an all-volunteer force, that in fact there has been much less popular mobilization against military intervention since we switched over to an all-volunteer force. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. In the second third of your talk, you showed a lot of posters that depicted workers in the war munitions industries.
Yes.
So you showed very effectively how producing ammunition could be transferred to the soldiers. Are you aware of any propaganda efforts directed at producers of foodstuffs, farmers and ranchers, people who were making textiles or foods for soldiers? Were there similar things, or was most of the focus on factory workers making munitions directly for the war effort?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's a great question, because the role of agriculture in the war is understudied. We have a few good studies, but it's been overlooked, whereas labor has been overstudied. And it was a very similar set of tropes. And I would add that farmers were also a vital constituency, not just during the war. I mean, farmers provisioned our soldiers and also provided relief to our allies, but especially after the war with the refugee crisis. There's a crisis of famine throughout Europe, and it's American farmers who meet that challenge. American farmers, particularly wheat farmers, especially around where I live, were some of the most determined opponents of intervention in the war and international commitments more generally. By 1949, 1950, they're some of the biggest supporters of food relief. So that also suggests not obviously their material interests were being served by having expanding markets, but it suggests that a very similar identification occurred for farmers. But unlike labor, farmers' interest groups in Congress, the Farm Bloc had been in place and had very strong relationships with Congress going back to the 19-teens, the 1920s. Labor was only just starting to cement a relationship, and mostly only with the Democratic Party, whereas farmers had connections to both parties and had a very well-organized set of trade organizations that were working with Congress and with the State Department to advance these policies. So some of this is elite-driven, but a big part of it is getting farmers to accept a responsibility that will be paid for in taxes, that they will then produce for through a government-regulated program that sets prices and sets quotas. So that similar kind of propaganda was helpful. And in a very similar way, the farmers, the studies that I mentioned, the Treasury Department, where many of them were done of farmers because it was conducted by the Bureau of Agricultural Economics. And so they had a long-standing interest in studying farm life. And farmers were particularly taken with the idea that they were putting food, into the ration kit of soldiers, and this helped mobilize them and politicize their sense of commitment to these large global government commitments starting in the war and continuing after. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about how the warfare state changed what it meant to criticize the size of the government in the post-war period. How did critics sort of not offend the moral sensibilities that you're talking about here while attacking the growth of the government?
Yeah, that's a great question, because those sensibilities are broken down now. We live in a time, and I think this gets forgotten today, because so much of the criticism of big government comes from the right today, but it started, another important strand of criticism of big government started on the left. The critique of the war, of the Vietnam War, and of the liberal establishment was a radical left project as much as it became a new right project. And this was a response to the overwhelming size and power of a government that seemed to survey and monitor everything by the 1960s, particularly for left groups. So it's across the political spectrum, actually, this effect is occurring, but with different consequences, different concerns, depending on ideology. So prior to World War II, the Liberty League had mobilized a campaign against the New Deal and had failed to unseat Roosevelt, but had succeeded in at least, not just the Liberty League, but a conservative coalition forming in Congress, had succeeded in stopping New Deal initiatives. So there was some traction being gained by criticisms of the WPA, for example, which was the target of investigations and of the Hatch Act, for example. So it was clear that big government, if by that we mean the New Deal or social legislation, was coming under fire and was in great trouble. And in fact, during the war, most of what we think of as the New Deal, the heart and soul of it that got most people to support the New Deal, was eliminated. By 1943, the CCC, the NYA, the WPA, planning, antitrust, these things were, I mean, antitrust is a more complicated story, but a very large part of the New Deal state had been dismantled, even as the government was expanding way beyond the boundaries of the New Deal welfare state. And so you get this dynamic I've described in my talk today, where there's an identification with the war, and then that allows people to accept these new obligations that keep that massive government going. After the war, liberals are committed to one kind of big government. So Truman liberals, for example, or Stevenson liberals are committed to one kind of big government that's centered around full employment. Republicans try to critique a kind of this New Deal for the world vision, and they effectively do shut down some of the more left-leaning initiatives, anything surrounding real economic regulation on an international scale, for example, becomes difficult, and the Bretton Woods institutions move in a direction very different from initially intended. But what's really impressive is how conservatives learn to embrace the outward face of the warfare state. This is what I'm working on in my second book project. As long as it can be used to advance the global mission of the United States and does not reorganize domestic politics. So when there's a very consequential and large discussion in Congress about housing, urban renewal, and the 1950 amendments to the Social Security Act, which produced Social Security as we know it today. Before then, it was actually a very different thing. They all take place within a debate that uses British socialism as a point of reference. Now, in the 30s, European programs, as Daniel Rogers has shown, were models for different ways of responding to the catastrophe of depression. By the late 40s, it's possible for conservatives to support or at least accept very large foreign aid packages for Britain, which was run by a Labour government, at the same time that that government's programs, so the Beveridge program, could be used to critique anything that looked like public housing or national health care provision or any kind of large-scale planning. Now, this doesn't mean that the welfare state shrank, quite the contrary. The FHA provided a way of subsidizing private loans, so big government, but channeling funds through private institutions, banks. And so you see this insurance model emerging as a compromise by which government provision can be provided, and yet conservatives' anxieties about a socialist state are allayed. And it's this cultural politics of internal subversion that's so useful. It's not just claiming that it might be communist, it's saying that there's a kind of encroaching internal subversion that draws on these larger cultural politics of labor, of the war. So, thank you for your question.
I'm wondering if we could walk forward a bit to the unraveling of what you call the social compact. And I'm wondering if it's connected. I mean, you've established the connection between attitudes toward federal taxation. I'm wondering if it's not also connected after a certain point to things like local property taxes, paying for public schools for other people's children, paying for public schools when you don't have children. Obviously, it might be connected to things like the Civil Rights Act, where we don't mind paying for other people's children's schools as long as they look like our children. But might it not also be that why should we pay for other people's children when there's no possibility that they're only going to have, they might have to fight in a war like we did?
Right. Yeah, really good question. And I think there are two ways to answer that question that are equally valid. One way is to say, we don't know. The research on this period is very confusing. It's fairly recent, and so sometimes it takes a while to sort out perspectives on the recent past. But there's a basic confusion here, which is that if you look at the polling data and a lot of the politics, the tax revolt is exactly as you say. It's a local, it's a California thing, and it's a property owner's response, and it has a lot to do with schools and rising assessments. If that were the case, though, it would make no sense for it to be able to spread nationwide. And what's really striking about the tax revolt is it does in the 1980s, and it gets attached to federal government. So I mentioned earlier that most Americans thought their federal income taxes were the fairest of all the different kinds of taxes that they had to pay. And by the 80s, that's not the case. So somehow, and Monica Prasad, who's a sociologist at Northwestern, has done interesting work on this, and so has Andrea Campbell at MIT. But they agree it's very hard to explain why this transfers from local anger at decisions around things like schooling to national anger against a federal government. And then not only that, but then you have conspiracy theory and sort of militia movements take off as popular movements in the 80s and the 90s that think that the entire federal government's been taken over by a conspiracy. And this becomes fairly prominent in many parts of the country. That kind of suspicion doesn't exist except among a very, very tiny group of people like in the John Birch Society in the 1950s. So the big explanation, the big causality behind, to address your question, I don't think we have that yet. Although if I wanted to say it's the federal government, which I don't necessarily want to for that period, you could point to how much the federal government was involved in locality spending at that point. You have Americans for Disabilities Act. You have a number of federal mandates beginning not just with Brown versus Board of Education, but the Great Society and Great Society programs. You've got the judges involved who are then imposing busing decisions. So there are a bunch of ways in which the federal government is impinging on local politics, even if the actual extraction is being done by the municipality or by the state government. So it could be that the federal government has gotten so big at that point that the fingers of the octopus are all the way down at the local level, and that would explain why it spreads outside of local areas like California that happen to have these strange their real estate values go through the roof, and then that affects, and their incomes don't necessarily go through the roof, and so then that affects their ability to pay their property taxes. Why does it go outside of that local effect? It may have to do with this, with not only Johnson's Great Society, but also Nixon's New Federalism, which actually increased the state's dependency on the federal government, even as it sought to move control and decentralize it to the states. I don't know if that satisfies you, but that's where I would start. Yeah.
We hear... Sorry. Hi. Yeah. We hear lots of stories about like the Tuskegee Airmen, Japanese Americans that fought for America that were, put in internment camps, as well as Italians. Mm-hmm. In terms of your propaganda during this time, well, not yours, but our propaganda at this time, were those people targeted, African Americans, Italian Americans, Japanese Americans? Were they like, put into their own magazines or newspapers that they would read that we need you to come and fight for us, we want you to join our factories? Or was it mostly that, textbook Caucasian female or, older gentleman who wasn't able to go off and fight, did they ever target the minorities?
Yes, they were. It's a good question because it suggests how how difficult it is to evaluate what's happening in a culture by looking at the production of images. So yeah, there was an effort to recruit African Americans. There was concern that African Americans might identify with the Japanese because the Japanese, after all, had demonstrated that white supremacy was not inevitable. They had wiped out all of the European empires in the Pacific, not just Pearl Harbor. This didn't, in fact, happen for more than a very small proportion of the black population. Most African Americans did not identify with Japan, but in fact really embraced their patriotic identity as a way to assert full citizenship. The right to fight was the phrase that African Americans pushed for. And so the propaganda tried to pull on that idea that America's it's free. It's unlike Nazi Germany. This was a land in which your racial identity didn't have to doom you, even if there were still grave injustices continuing in the country. At least the United States would produce a better world than the enemy would. This became an important theme that African American civil rights organizations then tried to appropriate and use to claim that they should have fair employment, that there shouldn't be segregation in the military. And over time, that strategy worked. I've written an article on military desegregation. It's quite striking that you have full desegregation of the military, at least its troop formation policies, before Brown versus Board is even implemented. We have all this focus on Brown versus Board, but the military was an institution that really shaped opportunities for mobility, social identity, local communities. So that could happen, but it was also true that it was equally possible that the government could use it as an excuse to say, look, save your complaints for after the war. Don't press for them now. So Japanese Americans were a great example of that conundrum where almost all the great preponderance of Japanese Americans, all the Japanese Americans living on the west coast of the United States were imprisoned en masse, and their civil liberties were violated, and they were sent to concentration camps. And the response to this could have gone in multiple ways. What's really striking is what a high proportion of Japanese Americans chose to serve in the military, and then one unit, the 442nd, which served in Italy, became the most decorated unit of the war. And then after the war, Japanese war veterans became important civil rights leaders who actually helped attain redress in the 1980s. So you see a similar sort of ability to claim citizenship by way of this military service. Having said all, this is true for Native Americans, it's true for Mexican Americans. Almost every group follows this pattern in one way or another. So there's a lot of research that could be done by graduate students on different movements and how they connected to each other across ethnic groups. Having said all of that, it is also true, however, that because this was bound up in a kind of militarization of what citizenship was, it became very difficult in a context of constant emergency that really never ended until 1989. It became very difficult to really push for rights at the moment when you could most claim your citizenship should be recognized in an emergency. And so even something like military desegregation, which is a major transformation of military policy, had very limited effects initially on race relations, even in the Army. Although over time, of course, the military became the most desegregated institution in American life and remains that way. Thank you. Yeah, this will be the last question.
Okay. There are many different differences between the situation that you paint and describe in World War II and the contemporary period, but there are certain ways in which, in many ways, it seems we continue to be a warfare state in our country today. And I'm curious about, we've had several times here at the university Andrew Basevich come and give presentations, and he's one of a number of commentators that have kind of argued that there's a kind of permanent mobilization of the military state in American society, that this warfare state is, in modified forms, is still alive and well and even stronger in some respects. I'm curious about your own research and whether or not it has led you to sort of speculate about the possibilities of demobilization, or whether or not there's some sense in which the future might be different from what you've described in the past.
Thank you for your question. These are all really great questions. Yes, I've thought about it. I get nervous going beyond the realm of my own research, and right now I'm still focused in the middle of the 20th century. I've done forays into the 60s and the 70s. Obviously, I think about the implications for today. What I'm struck by would be the ways that, well, let me step back for a second. When I use the term warfare state, I use it in a very special way that's different from the way it normally has been used in the past. In the past, it's meant a state devoted to war, a government devoted to war. And of course, I mean it in that sense, but that's really the least of it. I also mean it in another more abstract sense, that America, as a society, entered a warfare state in which war became a principal value. It became so principal that, in fact, it became a little invisible, especially, say, in the height of nuclear fear in the 50s and the 60s. And what this produced, I would argue, the warfare state's part of a larger project. What this produced was a disconnect between the political economy, the way you make the stuff to do the war, and the political culture, the way you get people to understand what they're doing and go along with it. And I say political culture rather than ideology, because ideology is a coherent system of ideas that form a structure that justifies a view of the world and a set of actions. But I'm more interested in the substratum for ideology, the political culture that can be shared by the far left, the far right, and the middle. In this case, rights, kind of a language of anti-statism that can be used to authorize the state. So what's really striking to me is this war didn't go away. World War I didn't go away. There are a lot of ways in which it had a legacy, but there was quite thorough demobilization from World War I. And the fiscal structure had looked like, Swiss cheese by the time Mellon was done with it. The army was, shrunk to a tiny fraction of what the military planners wanted. After World War II, there was no demobilization. There was a drop, but not a demobilization. But I think even more importantly than what happened to the budget or what happened to the size of the force, the country remained in a state of this sort of wartime mentality. The Soviets quickly replaced the Nazis. What's interesting about that, there's assumption, oh, well, of course they did. They're both totalitarians. Well, the very notion of totalitarianism that could include both communism and fascism equally is itself an ideological construct formed in those years from the late 30s into the early 50s. The Nazis and the Soviets did not consider themselves to be in any way related. They considered themselves to be world historic opposites, thesis and antithesis. Americans saw them, because Americans are liberal, and liberal not so much in today's use of the term liberal, but in a larger sense. Americans saw them as two different versions of continental absolutism under a new and terrifying guise. So you go into a period in the late 40s, and there's still a Manichaean imagery of a world about to devolve into global warfare, even before Americans are actually afraid of the Soviets. The voters are not afraid of the Soviets until very late in the 1940s. It's the foreign policy elite who are afraid of them in early 1946. So this culture kind of becomes a free-floating warfare culture anticipating global war, and some of the idealism around the United Nations and arms control is an expression of an attempt to find some way to master this expectation that there will be another global war immediately. Then you get the Korean War, and you have a pattern of Cold War militarization that persists to 1989. It's different from World War II because limited war, as it was called, which is a misnomer, is partial but permanent. whereas total war is temporary but total and absorbing a huge portion of the nation's effort. What this means is that while there's an ideology in which everyone is participating, everyone's at risk in a nuclear confrontation with the Soviets, anybody who has a seditious thought, who might have read the Communist Manifesto or had a friend who is a left-leaning, potentially a communist spy, anyone could jeopardize national security in this state of nuclear confrontation. The stakes of politicization of everyday life were even higher in the Cold War than in World War II. But the experience of the war, how do people encounter the government, how do they help project this power globally and sustain that state, were radically uneven. You had a defense sector that developed in certain parts of the country. The Southwest, for example, flourished with the defense sector. The Northeast, because it really was stronger on things like tanks rather than air power, began to collapse and become the Rust Belt. Different parts of professional society, different institutions like research universities flourished and others languished. So you have a society in which the benefits of warfare are radically uneven in their distribution. So like the draft is a great example where kids who went to college could get deferments and working class kids couldn't, and that was a big source of delegitimizing the mass conscription. What I am struck by today is all of the imagery of the Cold War remains with us, and it's just been applied to terrorism. It's really quite striking. There is an important twist, which is we've also revived a language and an imagery that's very old, that goes back to anarchism, late 19th century anarchism, to describe what the terrorists are, what motivates them, how they operate. And that tradition, which informed the counter-subversive tradition, folded into the culture of World War I and World War II. So in a way, we're returning to this earlier way of thinking about subversion and threats to national security, but it's implemented. It's authorized through a cultural politics, but it's implemented through a military institutional response that's predicated on great power confrontation. Even though the tactics are about asymmetrical warfare, strategy has not yet caught up with the world of transnational radical political actors. And you see we have all this force to deploy overseas, but it's not always terribly effective because we're deploying the kind of force that takes down nation states. But taking down nation states is one of the goals of these organizations that we're trying to combat. So I think what we see today is that the culture of the warfare state yet is very much alive and has become detached from its original material conditions. And it's, it creates a lot of confusion. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed speaking to you today.